I was thinking the other day, what is MVC? See, I'd heard a lot about it. There are all these web frameworks that were using it. Ember, Rails, Backbone, Express, Angular, and tons more. And I figured I better figure out what this is all about. So I looked online, and I found a very helpful diagram. You see, models are red circles. And then you have a green circle labeled view. And then you have a yellow circle labeled controller. And they're arranged in a triangle with arrows pointing between them. Thank you, that's all. That's, you know MVC now. So you can stop listening right now if you want. But I figured I would take it farther. I'd actually put MVC into an application. So I knew a little bit of Rails, so I decided to do that. There were some difficulties. For example, I couldn't find the red arrow key on my keyboard, and it's surprisingly difficult to arrange files in a triangle. But after overcoming these hardships, I decided I wanted to transfer my newfound knowledge to other MVC frameworks. So I thought to myself, is Ember the same thing as Rails? So I compared. Yep, they sure are. So, just in the interest of being completely thorough, I decided I'd go through their various classes and see if I can make them fit. Here is the matchup of Rails classes to Ember classes. You have your models in Rails matching up with DS model in Ember, your controllers in Rails matching up with your Ember controller, and so on and so on. But there are a few things that bothered me. First, I thought, this isn't MVC. There are other things. This is MVC-THR, which is not what I was sold at all. And then, not only were there two types of classes in Ember that Rails didn't have, but some of them didn't make much sense, the way they were being matched up. Rails views, for example, look nothing like Ember views. They look much more like the handlebars templates that Ember uses. Rails models not only match up well with ds.model, but they also match up pretty well with ember.object. Then I noticed, hey, there are two routers in Ember. What are they doing? So I looked closer. App.router is what we think of as a Rails router, while the Ember router is really more of a state machine, although that's less obvious since they changed it last January. And then the Ember view is like an event layer, which is where all the clicks are handled, all like the typing, did they just stop typing, all the stuff that would be not feasible to do on a server-side framework. Now that everything's matched up, we've arrived at what I'll call the orthodox view of how Rails and Ember match up. This is what you get from a simple reading of the guides, parsing what the core team is saying when they talk about Ember and compare it to Rails. There aren't any direct comparisons to Rails in the guides, I don't believe, but in their other publications there are. And this makes a little bit of sense. Actually, it makes quite a bit of sense when you're starting. And so you feel pretty good about yourself. But eventually, when you start really digging in, you'll notice some things that are a little bit weird. other people have noticed these things. And for the Nix viewpoint of Ember I'm going to present, this one was come up with by Giles Boquet in his book Heretical Guide to Ember.js. I'm going to present a skeleton of the arguments that he gives. So first off, you'll notice when you're programming your Ember controllers, they don't act at all like Rails controllers. There's a very small overlap between functionality. They really act a whole lot more like models in Ember, with the exception, of course, that they don't save things to the database like Rails models can. That leaves you asking the question, why are there two model objects and no controller? Where's our controller go? And what separates these two types of models? Well, the difference between the two models is given indirectly in a quote from the Ember guides. It says your Ember models will have properties that are saved to the server, while your Ember controllers will have properties that your app does not need to save to the server. These, in Rails, can be split up into an active record model, which deals with saving things to the database, and a service object, which deals with most of the logic, but doesn't contact the database directly itself. This is a design pattern that has been promoted in the Rails community the last few years as Rails apps have gotten bigger, and the old style, put everything in your active record object method of programming stopped working so well. There have been some talks about it. I believe Uncle Bob Martin came up with the name service object, and if you really want to know about this, there's a great book by Avdi Grimm. So now we want to deal with the controller question. What is the Ember equivalent of the Rails controller? So we know that in Rails, the controller, it mediates between the model and the view. And in Ember, we just need to find what mediates between the Ember controller, which is the equivalent of the Rails model, and the handlebars template, which is the equivalent of the Rails view. And that happens to be the Ember view. The Ember view is the equivalent to the Rails controller. Then, finally, both the Ember router and the app.router are combined into a Sinatra implementation. And then we have the heretical viewpoint upon Ember, presented by Giles Boquet in his new book. However, I don't think this is perfect, and the author agrees with me. To quote, "This alternative interpretation of how Ember works is definitely not perfect. And I think we can do better." What I want to do is make, not in this screencast, a perfect framework, but a method to getting towards a better way of understanding how to transfer our knowledge from one MVC framework to another. And this doesn't have to be just Rails to Ember. This can be Django to Ember, Ember to Angular, Backbone to Ember, anything, anytime when you want to transfer your knowledge from one framework to another, this will help. And so the first step is to completely get rid of this one-to-one crap. Trying to fit each Ember object into the functionality of a Rails object, while helpful for complete beginners, it loses so much nuance. Let's say we have a match which is 80%. The analogy 80% works. This is pretty good, but there's going to be that 20% where, say, the 20% of new features in Ember that they're not going to use because it doesn't make sense for them to look for those features there. And then there's the 20% on the Rails side where they're going to try to figure out how to cram that into that Ember object, even if that's not where it's supposed to be. And they'll get very frustrated because they're not following the Ember way, even though it fits their mental model of how it's supposed to work. And this is even worse for analogies that are bad. If you only have a 40% overlap, maybe it's the best overlap of any one-to-one match, but it's still not great. Instead of this, I'd like to present the bag of responsibilities theory. Here's a very abstract example of what you might do with that. Here we have two responsibilities. Rails has one class which contains both those responsibilities. It takes care of both of them. Meanwhile, Ember has those split into two separate classes. Then we'll add a third responsibility, which is in a separate Rails class, but is taken care of by one of the previous Ember classes. What would this look like if we were trying to do a one-to-one split? Well, parts of it are obvious. We would match up these two because that seems like the best fit. And this is good for the top responsibility. You know how to transfer that. It's good for the responsibility on bottom. You know how to transfer that. But the responsibility in the middle, when you're trying to transfer your knowledge, you aren't going to know where to put it. You're going to try to fit it into the Ember class on top when it really should go into the Ember class on bottom. And you're going to get mad because Ember doesn't work right. And so if I can prove to you that there is a situation like this, then we'll see that will prove that this way of thinking about transferring your knowledge is better than the one-to-one representation that has been attempted before. The example I'm going to use is pretty simple. It has no interactivity. It's just going through a route and displaying something. This is writing Rails in Ember. You know how if you have someone who's written C their entire life and then they try to write in Ruby or JavaScript, they'll use the Ruby or JavaScript syntax, but everything they do is going to be like 100-line methods with some for loops in between. That's writing C in JavaScript. We're going to be writing Rails in Ember, but there's still going to be enough of a mismatch that the one-to-one doesn't work, and you have to use the bag of responsibilities theory to fully capture all the nuance that's there. Our first responsibility is the URL mapping. In Rails, that's taken care of by routes.rb, and in Ember, that's taken care of by app.router. You'll notice that this code is very similar. It's just the Ember code is more verbose in one part, while the Rails code is more verbose in another. And this is the start of our bag of responsibilities mapping. Then we want to be able to redirect. In Rails, that can happen either in routes.rb or it can happen in the controller. In Ember, this is supposed to happen in the Ember router. It can kind of sort of happen in the controller sometimes, but you're really supposed to do it in the router. And I want to give the one-to-one theory as much of a fighting chance as possible. So give it the benefit of the doubt, we'll say that it can only be done in the Ember router for now. So here's how that is mapped on the bag of responsibilities graph. Next is grabbing the resources. In Rails, you're assigning the resources to an instance variable in the controller. In Ember, you're assigning it to the model for the route. Here's our graph. Then we have data persistence. In Rails, that's done with the active record. And in Ember, it's done, in this case, we're using DS model. And notice how incredibly similar these are. This happens to be the one thing that everyone agrees on. And if you look at this code, you can see why. There's no mistaking this for anything else. Here's it is on the mapping. Next, we want to specify a base template. In Rails, that's in the controller. We're rendering the edit template. In Ember, that can be done in either the router or the view. In one of these examples, the view, which is automatically selected by going to the new route, is given a template name of new instructor. And for the instructor edit route, it's rendering the template edit instructor from the route. This goes on the responsibility graph, and you'll notice an interesting pattern where the Rails controller seems to match up pretty well with the Ember router. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good mapping, and this is something that wasn't predicted by either the orthodox or the heretical viewpoint. But when we look at the data, when we map out the responsibilities and do some analysis, it just pops up and becomes very clear. Finally, we are specifying partial templates. In the Rails views, it's all in the views. In Ember, we can put it directly into the handlebars templates through a partial, or we can send it to the view, which then specifies a template name. And then we have completed our responsibility graph for this very, very simple request. And even with this very simple request, which was designed to play to Rails' strengths, a one-to-one is really messy. You're going to cut something in half. However, the biggest danger isn't necessarily cutting responsibility in half. It's when you try to do a one-for-one mapping, even if it works really well at first, if your Rails class, if all the responsibilities in the Rails class are mapped directly to Ember, you get this image in your mind of what that Ember class is supposed to do. But then, Ember is a different type of framework than Rails. It's a front-end framework. It can do more. It has a run loop. It can respond to clicks very easily. And that has to go somewhere. And you have this image in your mind, then you have to graph stuff onto it until you've made a monster. Not a cute monster like this one, but a big, confusing, scary monster that makes your code hard to refactor and makes it difficult for you to figure out why something is somewhere else and where you need to put your code. I hope this talk will be the guy with the flaming sword. About MVC as if it's one thing that can be described with circles and a triangle and some arrows. But that's not representative of how MVC is used today as a term. In reality, MVC is sort of like Kung Fu, where there are many styles, and they're all very different, even though they have this core commonality. It's not like this. It's more like this. Of course, is not the perfect and complete representation of how Rails and Ember match up. There is so much more. So many more responsibilities. And you can also do this for many other matchups of MVC frameworks for when you're trying to transfer knowledge between one and the other. That's something I want you to do and discuss. You can contact me on Twitter or through my website. Thank you very much.